The snow fell quietly over the city of Uppsala, coating the narrow cobblestone streets in a blanket of white. Yellow light spilled from the windows of the small wooden houses, and the scent of fresh bread drifted faintly from the bakery at the corner. For most, it was a scene of comfort and peace. For Ellen, it was the beginning of a season filled with fear. She had just returned from Akademiska Hospital, where the doctors had spoken in hushed Swedish tones that echoed endlessly in her ears. Her mother, Ingrid, was dying. The words had been clear, even though the doctors softened them as much as possible. Months, maybe less. Ellen's world, once anchored by her mother's warmth, now trembled beneath her. As she walked through the snow, her heart ached with every step. She longed for someone to lean on, someone who would understand the heavy silence inside her chest. And that someone, she believed, was Jonas. Jonas was tall, charming, and always carried himself with the air of someone who thought the world could be bent to his will. When Ellen had first fallen in love with him, she had admired his confidence. But lately, his confidence felt more like stone walls, walls that Ellen could not climb over, no matter how hard she tried. That evening, when she entered the small apartment they shared near the Firis River, Jonas was waiting by the window. The glow of the street lamps outside cast long shadows across his face. He looked at her, not with concern, but with impatience. "You look broken," he said flatly. "If you cannot handle this, how will you ever handle real life?" Ellen's breath caught. She had expected arms around her, words of comfort, a promise that she would not face this alone. Instead, she was met with cruelty disguised as wisdom. Jonas poured himself a glass of wine, his voice sharp as ice. "You need to learn. Suffering makes you stronger. Consider this a lesson." A lesson. That was what he called her grief. That was what he called the fading heartbeat of her mother. Ellen stared at him, her hands trembling. Something inside her began to stir. A small flame of anger. A whisper that told her she could not allow this to continue. She did not speak. Not yet. Instead, she turned away, hiding her tears as the snow outside continued to fall, covering the streets of Uppsala in silence. But within Ellen, silence was no longer enough. The following morning, Uppsala woke beneath a pale gray sky. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, and the Firis River flowed sluggishly under thin sheets of ice. Inside the apartment, however, the chill had little to do with the weather. Ellen sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long since grown cold. Across from her, Jonas scrolled through his phone, barely lifting his eyes to acknowledge her. The silence pressed against her like a weight, heavy and suffocating. She thought about telling him how frightened she was, how each day with her mother now felt like sand slipping rapidly through an hourglass. But the memory of his words from the night before stopped her. Broken. Lesson. Strength. They echoed in her mind like cruel bells. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was fragile, yet steady. The doctors, they said it could be weeks, maybe less. Jonas set his phone down, his expression unreadable. "Then you'd better prepare yourself. Falling apart won't change anything." The words struck her harder than she expected. His tone wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was distant, almost mechanical, as though her pain were a puzzle he could solve with cold logic. Ellen turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, a young couple walked past, laughing together, their scarves wrapped tightly as they leaned into one another for warmth. The sight twisted something inside her chest. She wondered, just for a moment, what it would feel like to be held like that in the storm of her grief. Jonas stood and slipped on his jacket. "I'll be at the gym," he muttered. "Don't wait up." The door closed behind him, leaving Ellen alone with the echo of silence once more. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to break free. Her mother needed her. Ingrid had always been her anchor, the one constant in a life full of shifting tides. And now, when Ellen needed an anchor of her own, the man she had trusted most was drifting further away with each passing day. As the hours passed, Ellen tidied the apartment, made lists of medicines, and called the hospital to confirm the next appointments. Yet all the while, a thought kept circling in her mind. If Jonas could use her suffering as a lesson, perhaps there was something he still needed to learn as well. Something she had not yet revealed. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the city once more, as Ellen's quiet determination began to grow. The ward at Akademiska Hospital was hushed, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint rhythm of machines. Ellen walked slowly down the corridor, her boots soft against the polished floor, her breath visible in the cold air that clung even inside the building. Ingrid lay by the window, her once bright eyes dimmed, but still filled with warmth the moment they found her daughter. Ellen's chest tightened as she approached, forcing a smile as she took her mother's frail hand. "Hello, Mama," she whispered. Ingrid's lips curved faintly. "You look tired, my little bird." Ellen shook her head quickly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm fine. I just wanted to sit with you." They sat together, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ellen traced the lines on her mother's hand, remembering every moment those hands had held her steady, wiped her tears, cooked warm meals through endless winters. The thought of losing them was unbearable. When Ingrid drifted into a light sleep, Ellen stepped out into the hallway, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The weight of loneliness pressed heavily on her shoulders, but before she could gather her strength, she saw Jonas approaching. He looked out of place here, his gym bag slung carelessly over his shoulder, his trainers squeaking against the hospital floor. For a brief moment, relief surged through Ellen. Maybe he had come to surprise her. Maybe he cared more than his words allowed. But as he drew closer, his expression was not one of compassion. It was annoyance. "You didn't answer your phone," he said bluntly. "I tried to call you twice." Ellen blinked. "I was with my mother." Jonas sighed, his voice sharp. "I told you, you can't just drown yourself in this. You have to learn to separate. If you keep clinging to her, you'll never stand on your own." Ellen stared at him, the sting of his words cutting deep. "She is dying, Jonas." His eyes flickered, but only for a moment. "All the more reason to prepare yourself now." The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Ellen turned away, her chest burning, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "Go home, Jonas. If you cannot be here for me, then leave." For once, he did not argue. He simply shrugged, turned on his heel, and walked away. Ellen stood alone in the corridor, her heart shattering piece by piece. But somewhere beneath the cracks, a seed of resolve began to take root. Jonas believed this was her lesson to learn. Perhaps he was right, but the true lesson would not be his to give. The night was bitter in Uppsala, the wind weaving through the narrow lanes and rattling the windows of old wooden houses. Ellen sat in her bedroom, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring at the flicker of a candle on the windowsill. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past the glass, glowing faintly under the street lamps. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Jonas. "You need to be tougher. Stop wasting your energy crying." Ellen's stomach knotted. She pressed the phone face down and pushed it away, her breath shaking in the cold air. His words no longer pierced her with the same shock as before. Now they only deepened the ache of betrayal. She pulled out a worn photo album from the drawer. Inside were pictures of her childhood, summers at the lakeside, winters building snow lanterns, her mother's laughter echoing in every page. Ingrid had always taught her that strength was not hardness, but gentleness carried through storms. Strength was sitting by someone's side when the night was at its darkest. Ellen traced her fingers over the photographs, hearing her mother's voice in memory. "You are braver than you know, Ellen. You just haven't seen it yet." Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled faintly. Perhaps her mother's words were the lesson she truly needed, not Jonas's cold lectures. The next morning, she prepared breakfast at the apartment, her movements quiet, her mind clear. Jonas appeared from the bedroom, yawning, his hair damp from the shower. He looked at her, puzzled by her calm expression. "You're not crying today," he said, as if it were a surprise. "No," Ellen replied softly. "I'm not." He smirked, pouring himself coffee. "Good. Maybe you're finally learning." Ellen said nothing. She only watched him carefully, the way he carried himself with careless pride, as though he had succeeded in shaping her into his image. But within her, something had shifted. She realized she no longer needed Jonas to hold her steady. She had begun to stand on her own, and that strength was hers, not his. She looked at him over the rim of her cup, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Perhaps you are the one who still has something to learn." Jonas froze for a moment, caught off guard by the tone in her voice. But he laughed it off, shaking his head. Ellen did not laugh. She simply turned her gaze to the falling snow outside, the corners of her lips curving ever so slightly. The lesson had only just begun. The days grew shorter as January tightened its grip on Uppsala. The river ran dark and slow beneath a crust of ice, and the streets sparkled beneath lantern light as the city huddled against the cold. Ellen visited her mother each day, bringing small comforts, warm scarves, books, her favorite lingonberry tea. Ingrid's strength was fading, but her spirit still glimmered, a gentle flame refusing to die. Each smile from her mother gave Ellen courage to continue. Jonas, however, became more distant. He spent longer hours away, always with excuses.
The gym, friends, work.
When he returned, he carried an air of irritation, as though Ellen's grief were an inconvenience he had agreed to endure. One evening, as the frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, they sat in silence over dinner. The clatter of cutlery was the only sound between them. Finally, Jonas spoke. "You cannot keep this up," he said. "You're drowning yourself in sadness. If you don't stop, you'll be nothing when she's gone." Ellen looked up slowly, her eyes steady. "And if you were in my place, Jonas, would you turn your back on the only person who has ever truly loved you?" For a flicker of a moment, something cracked in his expression. But he smothered it quickly, pushing his plate away. "You're too emotional," he muttered. "That's your weakness." Ellen rose, gathering the plates with calm precision. Yet beneath that calmness, a resolve had hardened like ice on the river. Jonas did not see her weakness. He was blind to the quiet fire growing inside her. And soon, that fire would burn brighter than he could ever imagine. Snowstorms swept across Uppsala, howling through the narrow alleys and piling drifts against doors. Ellen sat by her mother's bedside, reading aloud from an old book Ingrid had once read to her as a child. Her mother's voice was weaker now, but when she laughed softly at a remembered passage, Ellen felt hope flicker in her chest. After leaving the hospital that night, she returned to the apartment to find Jonas waiting. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight. "You stayed too long again," he said sharply. "You've forgotten about me completely." Ellen removed her coat, her voice calm. "My mother may not be here next week, Jonas. Forgive me if I choose her over your patience." His eyes narrowed. "You think this is love? It's obsession. You need to let go." Her heart pounded, but she refused to let him see her break.
"No."
"This is loyalty. Something you will never understand." He stared at her, speechless for once, before storming into the bedroom and slamming the door. Alone in the kitchen, Ellen leaned against the counter, her breath trembling. But instead of tears, a new thought took shape. Jonas had mistaken cruelty for strength. He had mistaken her devotion for weakness. He believed he was teaching her a lesson. But the truth was becoming clear. The lesson would belong to him. February arrived with biting winds and skies the color of slate. The day came when Ingrid's breath grew shallow, her hand frail in Ellen's grasp. Ellen stayed by her side, refusing to leave, whispering words of love as the machines beeped softly. "You are not alone, Mama. I'm here." With one final breath, Ingrid's eyes closed. Peace fell over her face, and the silence that followed was the kind that broke worlds. Ellen's heart shattered, but she held her mother's hand until it grew cold, refusing to let go until the nurses gently led her away. When she stepped out into the frozen night, Jonas was waiting by the car, his arms crossed, his breath clouding in the air. "It's done then," he said, his tone clipped, almost businesslike. Ellen froze, staring at him in disbelief. Grief swelled in her chest, Yet he offered no comfort, no embrace. Only distance. A tear slid down her cheek, but her voice was steady.
Yes.
It's done. And with those words, she felt something inside her shift. The girl who had once needed him was gone. In her place stood a woman who had nothing left to lose. The week that followed was filled with shadows. The funeral was quiet, the chapel lit with candles that flickered like fragile stars. Friends and neighbors embraced Ellen, offering words of comfort. Jonas stood apart, his expression unreadable, as though he were merely attending out of obligation. That night, back at the apartment, Ellen lit a single candle by the window. The wax melted slowly, the flame steady against the dark. Jonas entered the room, his voice cold. Now you must move on. Enough mourning. Enough weakness. Ellen looked at him, her eyes calm and unyielding. You speak of weakness, Jonas, but it takes more strength to love deeply than it does to turn cold. He scoffed, but she did not falter. You thought you could break me. You thought my pain would shape me into something you could control. But you were wrong. Her voice was low, deliberate. The only lesson learned here is yours. Jonas laughed uneasily, as though trying to dismiss her words, but something in her gaze unsettled him. For the first time, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Spring thawed the streets of Uppsala, the snow retreating to reveal cobblestones glistening in the sun. But inside the apartment, winter lingered in the silence between them. Ellen packed a small suitcase, folding her clothes with quiet precision. Jonas watched her from the doorway, his voice edged with disbelief. You're leaving? Yes, Ellen said simply. I am.
His jaw tightened.
After everything I've done for you? She turned, her eyes sharp as ice. What you did was teach me what love should never look like. And for that, I thank you. Jonas stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes, but Ellen held her ground. You cannot use my pain against me anymore. You cannot call cruelty a lesson. Not when I've found my strength without you. For once, Jonas had no reply. His silence was louder than any argument. Ellen closed the suitcase, lifted it with steady hands, and walked past him without looking back. The train carried Ellen north, through forests still capped with snow, past frozen lakes that gleamed beneath the pale spring sun. With each mile, the weight of the past began to lift. She thought of her mother, of the lessons whispered through years of love. Strength was kindness. Strength was loyalty. Strength was rising even when the world tried to break you. Jonas would remain behind in Uppsala, left only with the echo of his own words. He had tried to shape her grief into a weapon, but instead, it became her armor. In time, he would remember the day she left. The day he realized that the woman he thought fragile had walked away with more courage than he could ever summon. That was the lesson Ellen gave him. A lesson carved into silence, carried like a scar, never to be forgotten. And as the train pushed further into the horizon, Ellen closed her eyes, breathing in the promise of freedom. The snow was melting, and a new spring was waiting.